On October 24, 1942, in the thick, oppressive heat of the Solomon Islands, Private Robert Young Deer crouched in the shadows, his breath shallow and deliberate. The jungle around him buzzed with the sounds of unseen creatures, a constant hum that only added to the discomfort of the stifling night. But there was a different noise now, a crackle in the air that signaled something far more dangerous than the swampy humidity and the steady chorus of insects. Deer's unit, the 164th Infantry Regiment, had been on Guadalcanal for only 11 days. They were the first American Army unit to engage in an offensive push against the Japanese. It was October 13th when they had landed, and since then, the men had been steadily forced into the brutal rhythm of war. Now, at this moment, they stood on the cusp of a confrontation that would determine not only the course of the battle, but the very effectiveness of the tools they had been given to fight. Deer checked his M1 Garand rifle again, the cold metal cool against his fingertips. The rifle was a marvel, sleek and powerful, with its semi-automatic action allowing him to fire 8 rounds before needing to reload. It was the kind of weapon that represented America's new approach to war, industrialized, precise, and relentless. Yet, as he looked around at his fellow soldiers, he couldn't ignore the feeling that they too were being tested by the jungle, by the enemy, and by the weight of the history that was unfolding with every passing second. The M1 Garand had only recently been issued to the infantry, and it was already a source of mixed feelings among the Marines who still carried the old M1903 Springfield rifles. Some had doubts about the new weapon. Would it prove reliable? Would it make the difference in battle? The 164th Infantry, however, was about to show them just how decisive that difference could be. The jungle was still, and then it wasn't. The silence shattered with the unmistakable war cry of the Japanese, Banzai, a sound that turned blood to ice. The first wave of attackers surged forward, their figures barely visible in the darkness, but their intent was clear. Deer's heart pounded, his fingers, guided by training and adrenaline, tightened around the Garand. The rifle, almost instinctively, found its target. In the distance, the enemy moved like shadows, but every squeeze of the trigger brought one more enemy soldier closer to the ground. With each shot, Deer could feel the power of the rifle surge through him, its mechanical precision, a comforting reminder that this new weapon would play a pivotal role in this brutal struggle. The Garand, once seen as an unknown variable, was now a tool of war that would demonstrate its worth in the coming chaos. October 1942. As the battle unfolded on Guadalcanal, the soldiers of the 164th Infantry Regiment could already sense the brutal advantage they held. But that advantage wasn't just in their training or in their resolve, it lay in their weaponry. The M1 Garand wasn't just a rifle, it was a weapon that redefined infantry combat. And in its deadly wake, the Japanese soldiers, still armed with the old Arisaka rifles, were about to feel the overwhelming force of a new age in warfare. The M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle designed by Canadian-American engineer John Garand, was a technological marvel that had been adopted by the U.S. Army in 1936 after nearly 2 decades of development. Unlike the bolt-action rifles most of the world still relied on, the M1's gas-operated, rotating bolt system allowed it to fire automatically, one round after another, with each pull of the trigger. With a capacity of 8 rounds in its internal clip, a trained soldier could send a storm of lead downrange in a fraction of the time it took for a bolt-action rifle to be reloaded. Each shot from the M1 was faster, more controlled, and more devastating than its contemporaries, and the distance over which it could strike with deadly accuracy was far superior to that of the Arisaka. At the heart of this technological leap was the gas-operated mechanism. As the bullet exited the barrel, a small portion of gas would be siphoned off through a port, powering an operating rod that ejected the spent casing and chambered the next round. There was no need to manually cycle the bolt or break the soldier's sight picture to load the next round. Every squeeze of the trigger brought one more shot. By contrast, the Japanese Arisaka rifle, despite its strength and accuracy, belonged to an older era of warfare. Introduced in the late 19th century and heavily modified over time, the Arisaka rifle was a bolt-action weapon, requiring the shooter to manually cycle the bolt after each shot. This meant that after every round fired, a soldier would have to rotate the bolt handle, pull it back to extract and eject the spent cartridge, push it forward to load another, and then lock it into place. This process, though effective at longer ranges, slowed down combat efficiency, especially when under heavy fire. The Arisaka's magazine could hold only 5 rounds, and reloading required a soldier to use cumbersome stripper clips. The new Type 99 Arisaka, though chambered for a more powerful 7.7mm round, still lacked the rapid-firing capability of the M1 Garand. When it came time to reload, the difference in speed was undeniable. the American soldier could fire a new round every few seconds without interrupting his line of sight. The Japanese soldier, meanwhile, had to wrestle with his rifle, manually cycling the bolt in a time-consuming process that cost him precious moments in combat. October 24, 1942. For Lieutenant Kenji Yamamoto, the early moments of the attack were a blur. He had trained for this, had been molded into a soldier by Japan's strict military doctrines, steeped in the traditions of the samurai where honor and spirit triumphed over technology. But in the thick underbrush of Guadalcanal, where visibility was limited to mere yards, his weapon, the Type 38 Arisaka rifle, felt clumsy, outdated. The rifle was a finely crafted piece, with a reputation for long-range accuracy, but the dense jungle was no place for the advantages it offered. Yamamoto gripped the cold, heavy rifle with practiced precision as his men surged forward in their banzai charge. His Arisaka, with its long 31.4-inch barrel, had once been celebrated for its accuracy at distances that American rifles could only dream of. In the open plains of Manchuria or the rolling hills of China, the Type 38 had been a formidable force. But in the claustrophobic confines of Guadalcanal's jungle, it became more of a hindrance. The barrel, long and unwieldy, caught on thick vines and brush. He had to wrestle with it, struggling to aim it as he pushed forward. His soldiers, many of them new to the battlefield, found themselves in a similar position. Armed with the Type 99 Arisaka, they were at least equipped with a more powerful 7.7 mm round, but they still faced the same fundamental limitation, the slow, laborious process of cycling the bolt. Each shot required a moment of pause, a disruption of rhythm that forced the shooter to break his stance and lose precious time. Even the newer rifle, more advanced than the Type 38, couldn't overcome the disadvantage of a manual action in the face of American semi-automatic fire. The banzai charge was meant to close the gap quickly, overwhelming the enemy with sheer numbers and spirit. Yet, as Yamamoto pushed forward through the darkness, he could hear the unmistakable crack of American fire cutting through the air. For every round fired from the Arisaka, the Americans sent out a barrage of their own. Each pull of their trigger sent another round downrange, without delay, without hesitation. Yamamoto knew that his men, who had been told that their spirit would carry them through, were about to be tested in ways that went beyond the strength of their will. Despite their training, despite their discipline, they were facing a technological leap they couldn't match. Each time Yamamoto squeezed the trigger of his Arisaka, he knew the cost was more than just ammunition, it was time. Time to reload, time to adjust, time to die. October 24, 1942. The night exploded in violence. The soldiers of the 164th Infantry Regiment had spent the hours leading up to the battle preparing themselves, checking and rechecking their M1 Garands, ensuring their ammunition was secure, but nothing could have truly prepared them for the maelstrom that would descend upon Henderson Field. The first wave of Japanese troops came crashing through the underbrush, barely visible in the dense jungle, but their war cries rang out clearly through the night, banzai. The sound seemed to reverberate off the trees, a terrifying cry that shook the soldiers to their core. The ground beneath their boots seemed to tremble as the enemy advanced with terrifying speed, driven by the weight of a centuries-old tradition. Private Robert Youngdeer felt the adrenaline surge through his body as his rifle came to life in his hands. He fired without hesitation, the M1 Garand's action cycling smoothly, its powerful shots echoing through the night. Each time he squeezed the trigger, another round was released, another enemy soldier was sent to the ground. There was no time for thought, there was only action. Around him, the American soldiers, many of them just weeks into their deployment, fired relentlessly. They weren't just reacting to the enemy, they were responding to something deeper, something their training had instilled in them, the understanding that this fight would be won not by bravery alone, but by the unyielding power of their weapons. Private First Class James Cass of the 164th later recalled the feeling. The Japs came at us in waves, barely visible in the darkness except for the glint of their bayonets. With our Garands, we could put 8 rounds into them before they covered 30 yards. Each man was like a machine gun section. We'd fire, the rifle would cycle itself, and we'd fire again. No working a bolt, no breaking our sight picture. Just squeeze, boom, 8 times before reloading. In the chaos of the moment, it was easy to forget the advantages they held. The American soldiers had arrived with a weapon designed for modern warfare, while the Japanese soldiers, armed with their Arisakas, were still fighting a battle from a bygone era. With each banzai charge, the gap between the two forces became painfully clear. Colonel Bryant Moore of the 164th Infantry Regiment reported later that his men expended over 250,000 rounds of .30 caliber ammunition during the 2-day battle for Henderson Field. The volume of fire was overwhelming, and as the Japanese bodies piled up in front of American positions, it was evident that the M1 Garand was proving its worth. Private Robert Leckie, a Marine who witnessed the battle firsthand, observed the Army soldiers in action. "We thought they were green, these dog faces with their newfangled rifles," he recalled. "But when the Japs charged, those Garands spoke with a voice we'd never heard before. It was like a continuous roar, not the sporadic crack of our Springfields." The battle raged on through the night, and the relentless firepower from the 164th helped stabilize the line. The Japanese assault, though fierce, was no match for the American infantry's superior weaponry. The Garand's semi-automatic capability, its relentless, unbroken fire, shattered the illusion of invincibility the Japanese had built around their warrior's spirit. October 25, 1942. By the time the battle for Henderson Field was over, the American soldiers of the 164th Infantry Regiment had demonstrated the brutal effectiveness of their semi-automatic rifles. The Japanese, though brave and relentless, were beginning to grasp the scale of the disadvantage they faced. In battle after battle across the Pacific, the differences between American and Japanese firepower would become increasingly evident. It wasn't just the speed of the M1 Garand that made it a game-changer. It was the sheer volume of accurate fire it allowed the infantry to unleash. As the 164th had proven, a soldier armed with an M1 Garand could fire 8 shots in quick succession, reloading in less than 3 seconds, all while maintaining a steady sight picture. The rifle's semi-automatic action allowed soldiers to fire rapidly and efficiently, delivering a continuous barrage that could overwhelm enemy positions with little opportunity for the enemy to return fire. In contrast, Japanese soldiers, burdened with the older bolt-action Arisaka rifles, could only fire 1 shot at a time. The need to manually cycle the bolt after each shot and the limited 5-round capacity of their internal magazines placed them at an extreme disadvantage. Even the more powerful 7.7mm Type 99 Arisaka, though a formidable round, couldn't match the rapid and sustained fire of the M1 Garand. The slow process of reloading, often requiring the use of stripper clips, further hampered the Japanese ability to respond quickly in the heat of combat. The technological gap between the two weapons was staggering, but it wasn't just about the rifles themselves, it was about the system behind them. The United States had invested heavily in industrial infrastructure to mass-produce the M1 Garand, ensuring that nearly every infantry soldier would be equipped with one. By 1943, American factories had churned out millions of M1 Garands, with Springfield Armory leading the charge, producing 1,000 rifles per day by January of that year. This overwhelming production ensured that the American infantrymen would be armed with the most advanced rifle on the battlefield, giving them an undeniable edge. Japanese forces, on the other hand, struggled to keep pace with the production demands of modern warfare. Despite producing millions of Arisaka rifles throughout the war, they could never match the efficiency of American arms manufacturing. The Japanese military's reliance on bolt-action rifles, which had been designed for warfare in an earlier age, became a critical liability as the intensity of combat increased. Even their attempts to adapt, such as the development of the Type 4 semi-automatic rifle, were hampered by industrial inefficiencies and the scarcity of resources. As American forces pressed their advantage across the Pacific, it became clear that firepower, specifically the ability to sustain fire over long periods, was one of the most crucial factors in the success of their island-hopping strategy. The M1 Garand's ability to deliver rapid, accurate shots at multiple targets ensured that American soldiers could effectively suppress enemy movements, neutralize entrenched positions, and secure objectives with unprecedented efficiency. While Japanese forces were forced to adapt to new defensive tactics, shifting from banzai charges to more entrenched, fortified positions, their limited firepower made it increasingly difficult to hold their ground. The Garand's rate of fire was not just an advantage, it was a strategic shift that altered the course of the Pacific War. In battles like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan, American soldiers wielded their M1 Garands with lethal precision, decimating Japanese forces who were unable to match the sheer volume of American firepower. October 25, 1942. In the maelstrom of Guadalcanal, it wasn't just the M1 Garand's technical superiority that made the difference, it was the psychological advantage it provided. For American soldiers, the Garand was more than a rifle, it became a symbol of invincibility. The relentless sound of semi-automatic fire echoed through the jungle, the rhythm of each round fired offering not just physical force but a mental edge. It was a sound that the Japanese could not ignore, a mechanical roar that felt like the unyielding march of American superiority. Private Robert Leckie, a Marine who witnessed the firepower of the 164th Infantry firsthand, would later reflect, "We thought they were green, these dog faces with their newfangled rifles. But when the Japs charged, those Garands spoke with a voice we'd never heard before. It was like a continuous roar, not the sporadic crack of our Springfields." The rhythmic ping of the M1 Garand, its distinctive sound when an empty clip was ejected, became a defining characteristic of American firepower in the Pacific. To the Japanese soldiers, it was not just a reminder of the American rifle's rate of fire, it was a psychological weapon that compounded their fear. Each ping was a sign that the enemy was reloading and preparing for the next barrage. To a soldier trained to fire only once, the ceaseless flow of American fire became a wall of sound that threatened to engulf them. The constant barrage of semi-automatic fire, while overwhelming in its volume, also had a deeply demoralizing effect on the Japanese. Sergeant Mas Watanabe of the 29th Infantry Regiment, who survived the October offensive at Guadalcanal, wrote in his post-war memoir, "We were told the Americans were soft, that our Yamato spirit would overcome their material advantages. Our officers assured us that one Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. But when we charged their lines that October night, it was like running into a wall of lead. Every American soldier seemed to have an automatic weapon." The power of the Garand's semi-automatic action was more than just a physical advantage, it was a mental one. Japanese soldiers, accustomed to the pace of bolt-action rifles, were unprepared for the intensity of American firepower. The gap in rate of fire was staggering. While the Japanese struggled to reload and manually cycle the bolt of their Ariskas, the Americans could maintain a constant flow of rounds. This difference wasn't merely tactical, it was psychological. The Japanese had been taught to rely on their spiritual strength and discipline, but when faced with such a relentless assault, those ideals began to crumble. The Banzai charge, once a weapon that struck terror into the hearts of their enemies, was now rendered obsolete. The American soldiers, who had been forced to fight in smaller, more mobile units, found themselves with an overwhelming advantage in both firepower and morale. As the Japanese soldiers charged into the hail of M1 Garand fire, they were forced to contend not only with the deadly efficiency of American technology, but with the cold, relentless march of a war machine that refused to falter. The Garand's constant fire made it difficult for the Japanese to close the distance and use their bayonets or engage in close-quarters combat, where they had once excelled. The very nature of the Pacific War had shifted, and the battlefield was no longer a place where spirit and courage alone could carry the day. The soldiers of the 164th Infantry Regiment, armed with their semi-automatic rifles, were the embodiment of that change. For the American soldiers, the psychological edge was just as vital. They knew their Garands could keep firing long after the Japanese had exhausted their ammunition. They knew that the sound of their rifles would intimidate the enemy, and they began to believe that no matter how fierce the attack, no matter how many waves the Japanese threw at them, they would have the firepower to withstand it. The confidence that came with this knowledge was a crucial factor in the American approach to combat. The Marines, who had long been skeptical of the M1 Garand, had seen firsthand the devastating effectiveness of the rifle. Staff Sergeant Mitchell Page, who fought alongside the 164th, observed the same thing. "With our Garands, we could put a wall of fire in front of the Japs, and they had nothing to answer with. It was like a machine gun section in every soldier's hands." November 1943. The battle for Guadalcanal had been brutal, but it was only the beginning of a broader shift in combat tactics that would shape the entire Pacific War. The American infantry, armed with their M1 Garands, had proven the devastating power of semi-automatic fire in static defensive positions. But as the Allies moved forward, the importance of maneuver warfare became increasingly apparent. The ability to move rapidly while maintaining fire superiority, something the M1 Garand excelled at, would be key in future engagements. The M1 Garand's advantages weren't just felt when soldiers dug in. Its design allowed American infantry to execute fire and maneuver tactics with precision. While one fire team laid down suppressive fire, another could advance, knowing that the fire from their rifles would keep the enemy pinned down. The ability to fire multiple rounds in quick succession, without the need to reload or cycle a bolt, gave American forces the freedom to maneuver more effectively, ensuring that they could sustain pressure on the enemy while continuously advancing. In contrast, the Japanese were limited by their bolt-action rifles. Even the newer Type 99 Arisaka, though chambered for a more powerful round, could not match the rate of fire of the M1 Garand. As a result, Japanese infantry often found themselves caught in defensive positions, unable to respond quickly to American advances. The slow, deliberate pace of reloading and cycling the bolt, compounded by the limitations of their ammunition supply, meant they could rarely match the speed of American tactics. On islands like Tarawa and Saipan, where the terrain demanded rapid movements and constant adaptation to shifting front lines, the difference between American and Japanese firepower became a glaring weakness for the enemy. The Japanese soldiers were forced to rely more on entrenched positions and defensive strategies, while American forces, equipped with the M1 Garand, could advance with overwhelming firepower at their backs. At Tarawa, the first large-scale amphibious assault in the Pacific, American Marines faced an entrenched Japanese force on a tiny island. The Japanese had fortified their positions heavily, and the fighting was intense. But the Marines, armed with the M1 Garand, were able to suppress the enemy with deadly accuracy as they moved from position to position. Where Japanese soldiers had to pause to reload, the American infantry could keep firing, creating a near-constant stream of suppressive fire that made it almost impossible for the Japanese to respond. This relentless fire pressure became a defining characteristic of American tactics. In smaller engagements, it was the same story. American squads, armed with their semi-automatic rifles and supported by Browning automatic rifles, could put out hundreds of rounds per minute. Meanwhile, Japanese squads, armed with bolt-action rifles, could barely keep up with the American rate of fire. The firepower disparity wasn't just a matter of technology, it was a matter of tactics. And the American approach was proving superior. As American forces continued their island-hopping campaign, they began to take advantage of the M1 Garand's strengths in a way the Japanese had not anticipated. The ability to fire and maneuver, to suppress enemy positions while advancing, gave the Americans an almost insurmountable edge in the increasingly mobile battles that would define the war. Where the Japanese sought to defend and regroup, the Americans relentlessly pressed forward, confident in their ability to lay down a wall of fire that could not be matched. The difference in firepower wasn't just about killing the enemy, it was about control. The M1 Garand's ability to maintain constant pressure on the enemy gave American forces an unprecedented level of control over the battlefield. Whether they were charging into close-quarters combat on Iwo Jima or maneuvering through dense jungle on Bougainville, the American infantry had the ability to sustain fire while moving, ensuring that no matter the terrain, they would always have the upper hand. January 1944. By the time American forces had captured key islands across the Pacific, the Japanese were beginning to realize the full scope of their disadvantages. The Banzai charges that had once been their hallmark, frenzied, desperate assaults designed to overrun the enemy, had proven to be ineffective against the overwhelming firepower of the M1 Garand. The American infantry, with its semi-automatic rifles, could cut down wave after wave of attackers with unrelenting precision. As the battlefronts moved forward, the Japanese began to adapt. The psychological toll of facing American firepower was immense. The belief in the invincibility of the Japanese soldier, bolstered by centuries of warrior tradition, had been shattered. Now, instead of charging the enemy in open battle, Japanese commanders were forced to rethink their strategies. The Japanese military's earlier reliance on direct assault, rooted in a belief that spirit and determination could overcome material disadvantages, was being replaced by a more defensive, survival-oriented approach. On islands like Peleliu and Iwo Jima, the Japanese dug in, fortifying their positions with an emphasis on defense in depth. They sought to create near-impenetrable strongholds, where they could use the natural terrain and fortified positions to their advantage. These new tactics were born of necessity, a response to the overwhelming firepower that had repeatedly torn apart their forces in previous engagements. Yet even this shift in tactics was hindered by the continuing disparity in firepower. While the Japanese tried to hold fast behind rocks and bunkers, their bolt-action Arisaka rifles remained a critical weakness. The longer-range accuracy of the Type 38 and Type 99 Arisakas was useful in certain contexts, but it didn't compensate for the ability of American forces to pour suppressive fire into enemy positions without needing to reload or break their stance. American soldiers, armed with their M1 Garands, could deliver devastating fire on enemy positions from a distance, pinning down the Japanese long before they could attempt to counterattack. The Japanese attempted to counter this with new weaponry, most notably the introduction of the Type 4 semi-automatic rifle, which had been developed in response to the American M1 Garand. The Type 4 was designed to give Japanese infantry a fighting chance by providing them with their own semi-automatic weapon. However, Japan's industrial capacity had already been stretched to its limits. Only a small number of these rifles were ever produced, and even fewer were deployed in combat. In contrast, the United States had already produced millions of M1 Garands, ensuring that every infantry soldier, regardless of rank, had access to the same level of firepower. The sheer scale of American industrial production made it impossible for Japan to keep up. Even with their new rifle, the Japanese could not overcome the massive disparity in the rate of fire and the logistical advantages of the American military. As the war in the Pacific continued, Japanese tactics grew more desperate. While their soldiers still demonstrated incredible bravery and commitment, they were increasingly hindered by outdated weaponry. The Japanese had no answer to the volume of fire that American soldiers could deliver, and their reliance on older technology continued to cost them dearly. The development of the Type 4 rifle, though a symbol of Japan's attempt to modernize its infantry, only highlighted the limits of their technological capacity. Even when Japan attempted to copy the M1 Garand in the form of the Type 4 rifle, their efforts were stymied by the industrial inefficiencies of their wartime economy. The Type 4, though a remarkable design in some respects, was produced in limited numbers, leaving the bulk of Japanese soldiers still armed with the slower, bolt-action Arisakas. August 1945. The war in the Pacific had stretched on for years, with countless battles fought in the jungles, on beaches, and in the fiery heat of the island-hopping campaign. The American soldiers, armed with their M1 Garands, had become a force to be reckoned with. From Guadalcanal to Okinawa, the impact of the M1 Garand was undeniable. The rifle had not only reshaped the tactics of infantry warfare, but had also become a symbol of American technological superiority in the brutal conflict of World War II. As the final days of the war approached, the Japanese military, despite their earlier adaptations, were facing the harsh reality of their position. The banzai charges that had once been a powerful weapon had become futile in the face of unrelenting semi-automatic fire. The defensive tactics that Japan had adopted could not match the speed and firepower of the American infantry. Even when the Japanese soldiers sought to make a stand behind reinforced positions on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the American M1 Garand proved devastatingly effective. By the time the United States had reached Okinawa, it was clear that the technological advantages provided by the M1 Garand had been decisive in the Pacific campaign. American forces, armed with superior firepower, could land on heavily defended islands and establish beachheads with relative ease. The power of the M1 Garand allowed American infantry to maintain a level of suppressive fire that kept the Japanese pinned down, enabling maneuvering units to break through enemy lines. But it wasn't just on the battlefield that the M1 Garand left its mark. The legacy of the rifle would extend far beyond the Pacific War. The success of the M1 Garand in World War II influenced military rifle development across the globe. In the Soviet Union, the lessons learned from the Garand were incorporated into the design of the SKS carbine. In China, the Type 56 carbine was directly inspired by the Soviet design, which in turn had been shaped by the M1 Garand. Even in Europe, countries like France, Italy, and Belgium would develop their own semi-automatic rifles, taking lessons from the effectiveness of the M1 Garand and its role in American military supremacy. Even after the war, the M1 Garand continued to serve in combat. During the Korean War, it remained the standard infantry rifle for American forces, proving once again its superiority over bolt-action rifles and ensuring that the United States maintained its technological edge in a new and rapidly changing conflict. As American soldiers prepared for the next phase of warfare in the Cold War, the M1 Garand continued to serve as a symbol of firepower and efficiency. In the early 1950s, the rifle was gradually replaced by the M14, but its legacy would endure. The M1 Garand's design influenced not only the development of future infantry rifles, but also how modern armies would approach the concept of infantry combat. For Japan, however, the M1 Garand's impact was even more poignant. In the 1950s, when the United States began equipping the newly formed Japanese Self-Defense Forces, JSDF, with M1 Garands, it was a bitter irony. The Japanese soldiers who had once fought against the Garand were now trained with it, using the same firepower that had overwhelmed their predecessors. The very rifle they had once faced as the symbol of American dominance was now a tool in their own hands.